Hello and welcome to the weekly video lecture. This one's going to be on political parties, and we'll have two parts. One will take a closer look at both how the system works and at the history of the American political party system. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Welcome back to this video lecture on political parties, and let's start off by defining political parties. They are organized groups that attempt to influence government by electing their members to office. That's an important distinction because other groups, like interest groups, are also seeking to influence government, but they're doing it through different ways. So what else do political parties do? Well, they help government respond to the needs and desires of citizens, typically through governing. They also organize public, especially voters, and interest groups to have a voice in politics. They mobilize large groups of people to participate in the political arena and vote. And they recruit candidates, they regulate the number of candidates, and they develop governing strategies. Parties also provide an important link between the public and the government. Not really quite as much as they used to. In the past, when people didn't have access to a steady stream of news like we do today through social media and online news and the internet and TV, in the past, people would form an attachment to political parties and then they would tend to vote the party line, and they might go a long time between hearing any news or reading a newspaper, especially if they lived in rural areas. And so they just kind of trusted the parties. Today, we don't really need to do that. We have the ability to research and find out information on our own, but still, parties do have this role where they are an intermediary link between us, the voters, and the government. And this is especially true in elections because parties really rev up their activity. They're really trying to get as many people as possible to come out and support them so that they can try to have more power. And so political parties are kind of inherently competitive. They are seeking to achieve better results than other parties that have different objectives or policy preferences. And at the same time, they're also responsible for informing us as voters about what they want to do and what they're up to when it comes to their positions on certain issues. There's another important term to know, and that is partisanship. And what that means is identification with or support of a particular political party. A partisan is somebody who is identifying with a specific political party. So if somebody's participating in some kind of activity that is partisan, it means that there is a political party or political, uh, you know, involvement that's happening. There's another important term, which is party identification, and that refers to individual voters' ties to a certain party. Just in the same way that somebody might pick a certain sports team, people tend to pick a particular political party, and that's their team. Team red, conservatives, Republicans; team blue, Democrats, liberals. Even if somebody is not a hardcore partisan and they're not committed to a particular party, meaning they haven't registered to vote for a specific party, usually people do tend to lean, meaning have a preference toward one of the major parties. These types of attachments tend to be the most long lasting when they're formed as a young person, especially if they're what's known as a party activist, which is somebody who's really involved with the party. They're organizing with the party. They're spending a lot of time and energy hanging out with the party. Another important term is party polarization. And this refers to how the parties interact. Usually, if we have polarization, it means there's a really hard dividing element between the two major parties. And I say two major parties because we're talking about the American political system, and right now there are only two major parties. So polarization is this hard split between the parties on most policy issues, and there's really not a whole lot of compromise or bipartisanship or crossover happening. They're basically like two teams on a football field facing off, and they both think that a gain made by the other side is going to be a loss for their side. Most analysts would say that Congress is the most polarized it's been in decades, meaning the two sides are really far apart on a lot of issues and they don't cooperate much. Although, what's interesting is that if we were to look at the majority of American voters are not as polarized as the parties are. If you took a poll, most Americans are actually pretty moderate and they tend to be closer than you would think when it comes to agreeing on major policy issues. What ends up happening is that the more ideological people become in politics, the more polarized they become. And oftentimes, if you get really ideological party leaders, they tend to have a lot of power and they tend to only want to put forward bills that are going to be, perhaps opposed more harshly by the other side. And what's been happening over the last 25 years is the partisan divisions, this polarization, have definitely been increasing. And the interesting thing is that it seems to only happen when people are lumped into these partisan groups. So if we were to look at other typical divisions between people, for instance, gender division, men, women, people who are non-binary, there tends to be a difference in how those groups are going to vote. Highly educated, less educated, people from different racial groups. There's a division, there's some polarization, but it's actually not as stark. As soon as we start seeing other people as either Democrats or Republicans, all of a sudden people really start to see the other side as somebody they need to oppose. And that has really been increasing since the late 1990s, if you see by this graphic that's up on the screen. Now let's transition to look at something a little bit different here. Oftentimes, people are only focused on the political parties in election years, but political parties actually are constantly busy, and there is typically a pretty large organization behind the parties, and they're divided into different parts, focused on different areas of the political system. And for example's sake, I'm just going to create a fictitious political party so that you can see what I mean. I'm just going to call it the American Party. This is a fake party. I'm just using this as an example so you can follow along. Let's say we had this fake American Party. Okay, there would be a national American Party that would be focused on national elections. They would be focused on trying to coordinate all the other parts of the party, including parties that are in each state, because each state would have its own separate organization that would be just focused on the state elections. And then there would also be smaller county focused aspects of the party. So we would have one national American party. And that's at the top of the pyramid that we're looking here. They would coordinate the national political party convention every 4 years to pick their party's nominee for president. And they would have a national committee that would be trying to raise money on behalf of this American party. And then this national party would somewhat oversee the rest of the country. So each state would have its own state elections, and the National Party is going to try to have a little bit of influence and donate some money to these individual state parties, these state American parties. But these state American parties are going to have a lot of freedom. They're separate entities. They are going to maybe coordinate with the National American Party just a little bit, but they also have a lot of autonomy. And then you have county conventions. So there's going to be county parties. So we might have the Sacramento County American Party, and they would be focused on local elections. And so they might be taking some money from the state American Party and the National American Party. But again, they're going to be somewhat autonomous. But if we're looking at where they fit into the national hierarchy of the party, we've got the national party that's really in charge and is trying to set the tone. And then we've got the individual state parties. And then we've got the local county parties. They're all focused on winning elections at different levels of our federal system. Other important terms when it comes to political parties. Political parties are trying to find representatives to represent them in different elections. So to get to the part where they can settle on one candidate for a particular political position, they need to have primaries where a lot of different people are running to represent the party, and then eventually they'll pick one person and nominate that person who will represent them in the general election. So it's the primaries are kind of like playoffs where multiple candidates are trying to represent the party. And then once they get to the part where they let the voters pick that final person to represent them, now they're kind of moving on to the finals, which would be the general election, where they would face off against other nominees from other political parties. Now, what about this recruiting of candidates? This is kind of an interesting process, and it's actually much more informal than you might think it is. Basically, you have your party leaders, your people who are either, you know, they've already been elected, or people who are maybe donating money to the party, or just maybe they're business leaders who are really active in the party. Any of those people could be on the lookout for new people that they want to bring into the party and perhaps represent them in different political offices. And so these party activists might approach somebody. Maybe they have them go to lunch or dinner, or they have a meeting with them, and they talk to them and they say, hey, we think that you have a good, strong leadership record. Maybe you're really telegenic. You have a record that's really impressive. Maybe you served in the military or have a business record or some other type of experience that people really like. You don't have any major scandals that we know of, so the media is not going to make you look bad, and you just have a way with people, so people are going to want to donate money for you to run for office. So those are all things that these party activists are looking for. Then they would approach this potential candidate and say, hey, we want to support you to run for a particular office. That's how it happens. There are obstacles to becoming a candidate. It's very expensive to run for office. You have to spend a lot of time trying to raise money because of those expenses. And then you can run into something called gerrymandering, where a state has drawn its legislative districts in a way that really heavily favor certain political parties. And if you're not from those parties, then basically the odds are pretty stacked against you. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the second part of this lecture. So after primary elections, we have the general elections. General election is where the voters get to decide who among all of the major parties will they pick to represent them in certain offices. And this is essentially a game of voter turnout, where basically the two political parties are trying to get as many of their registered voters to turn out and vote as possible. That's what it all comes down to. It's not how many voters you have registered, it's how many of your registered voters actually will come to the polls. And parties will work with other interest groups to call people, go knock on their door, send them things in the mail, trying to get them to show up at the polls. And this has really become a science where they have huge databases of people, and they're trying to figure out where do they need to spend the most of their money and the most of their time to try to get more people to come vote. Once they get past the election phase and the organizing phase, then you get to the part where the parties have had their representatives elected to office. And the parties don't go away at that point. Parties form the basic organization for governing and for implementing certain policies. And when it comes to Congress, everything is organized by party. So you have the majority party, which is the party that holds most of the seats. In the House, they would get to select the Speaker of the House, the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. The party that holds a minority of the seats also gets to have votes as to who their leaders are going to be, but they're not going to ask the majority party who they should have be in their leadership. So it's always going to be along party lines for the minority group. The majority party gets to select the chair of all the committees, and they also get to control the legislative agenda. Each of these parties actually get to be, how do I put this? Divided up into smaller groups called factions. So there are divisions within each of the political parties. For instance, we can look at the Republican Party and we can identify 4 different factions. including pro-business conservatives, far right or alt-right folks who are, very, very conservative. There are social and religious conservatives who base their choices on, perhaps, their own religious beliefs. And then you have libertarians who really advocate for smaller government. And then in the Democratic Party, there are fewer factions, but there are two, and they're pretty distinct. So there's the liberal wing of the party, which is more progressive. They're going to advocate for more socially democratic policies like universal health care, also known as Medicare for all. And then there are traditional Democrats, also known as centrists, who tend to be more moderate. What's interesting is that the Democratic Party is going through some shifts, as is the Republican Party. When it comes to the Democratic Party, the core of the party that's emerging consists of Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and women. And a lot of this is based on the Democratic Party's position on the civil rights movement, immigration, desegregation, pay equality, etc. Over in the Republican Party, there's been a shift from a focus on free trade and less business regulation to more of a populist focus on immigration and trade restriction in order to try to boost homegrown manufacturing. There are some criticisms of our political system in the United States. Remember, we only have two major parties. And there is one criticism that these two parties really don't represent everybody very well, and that these parties are essentially, subsidized by big corporations or big labor groups and just wealthy people in general. So really, this criticism would say there's not a whole lot of difference between the two major parties. There's no group that's really looking out for ordinary, quote unquote, ordinary, um, less powerful Americans. And that results, they say, in an unequal democracy in which the interests of the poor are largely ignored. So that would be one criticism of the system that we have. Now, the American system is somewhat unique because a lot of other countries have more than two political parties, and there is a bit more diversity in the ability of voters to identify with different groups of different political groups that might reflect their beliefs more adequately. And another criticism is that having two major political parties does lead to more polarization, because if you have two groups facing off, it's a zero-sum situation. If one group wins, another group loses, or at least through that perspective, that's what the outcome would be. And it's important to note that the founders of the Constitution didn't necessarily envision, or at least didn't want to see, the rise of parties, although it does happen pretty quickly after the Constitution is ratified. On the other side, people counter the criticisms by saying political parties are important because they do increase political participation. They do reach out to voters and try to get them to the polls, and that does lead to more participation. They do provide important information to voters, and they do organize things within government, and that leads to the outcome of important actions being taken through governing. We're going to go ahead and finish this first part of the lecture by completing a simulation, and you can go into the discussion questions to answer this and then respond to these associated questions and to each other. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this part of the lecture here with the simulation, and then once you're finished, go ahead and start part two. Thanks for listening.